Okay, we are ready to go. So what we're going to do today is we are going to change our focus from perceiving the outside world that we were looking at with perception to now sort of using our internal representations and understanding those when we take a look at visual imagery. So before we get to that, though, we have the return of social media development assignment number 5, and we also have the return of innovations and suggestions. So if you have any ideas for the course, that link is now available in the announcements on your Canvas course page. So the link to make new suggestions is available, and the link to vote on previous suggestions is also available, so take advantage of that to let us know what kind of ideas you have for the course. But then also for social media development, we are back, and we are going to continue with our finding of our community, building those connections. And it occurred to me that we kind of started a little bit backwards in the sense that we went out to take a look at psychologists across the world. And then a couple of assignments ago, we connected to APA, APS, and PsyChi, all of these international and national organizations. And we've kind of neglected our local community. So you do want to have sort of connections, use your social media profile to connect to your local community. So we're going to start that off here in assignment number 5 by following the following three accounts. So you are invited to follow some of your local accounts, and these are all going to be IU University accounts, starting with the IU South Bend account. So this is the general campus university account. So it's at IU South Bend, and this will post information that you can use as a student, opportunities, events that are at a university-wide level, and again also granting opportunities, internship opportunities, things like that. They will post on this feed. So we're going to start off with IU South Bend. Then we're going to get a little bit more specific, and for most of you, it's going to be IU South Bend College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, which is the college that you're a part of. So we're going to follow this one as well, so IUSB CLAS, and then this gives you more kind of focused information about opportunities and events and things that are going on in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And then the last one, because I do like to encourage scholarship, encourage research, I do like the idea of taking students from being passive consumers of information to more active contributors and producers of information. So the last one we're going to follow is the IUSB Center for Excellence in Research and Scholarship. So that's at IUSB_CERES. And this is a site that gives you information on opportunities, programs, all having to do with research and scholarship, with really producing the next wave of psychology knowledge. So those are the 3 that we're going to do for this social media professional development assignment. So as usual, send me a screenshot of your following via Canvas assignments. The assignment tab is Step 5, Local Community. And as usual, that's in the assignments page in Canvas, Social Media Professional Development, Step 5, Local Community. And the due date on that is going to be March 2nd, this Monday, by midnight. All right, any questions on that one? All right. So now we're going to turn to the idea of visual imagery. And this is going to be the last topic that we cover before exam 2. So this is going to be the last piece for exam 2. So speaking of exam 2, just so that you have that on your radar, it is going to be a week from today. So it's going to be Tuesday, March the 3rd. It's going to happen in class. We're going to cover the chapters that we have covered, specifically our perception chapter, the visual imagery chapter, and then also the reading for the Lamode theory from the comics grid. Those will all be included on the exam. The lectures and CogLabs that we're going to cover are the following. So we've taken a look at visual search and signal detection. Today we're going to finish up with mental rotation. And then basically everything that was not everything since chapter 1, including our intro to perception that happened before, exam number 1, including our intro to perception that happened before exam number 1, is going to be on exam number 2. So chapter 3, signal detection, ecological psychology, picture perception, the Lamont theory, and then today's look at visual imagery will all be on exam number 2. We are going to start up on memory next class. That's going to be on exam number 3, and that's just designed so that we're going to finish this class and you'll have a week to review it if needed for exam number 2. Format of exam number 2 is going to be the same as exam number 1. So just to remind you, there's going to be 2 sections, all multiple choice. Section number 1 is going to cover material from the readings that were not covered in class. So these are the required readings that we just don't have time, but you should be aware of in cognitive psychology. Section 2 is the material from the readings that we do cover in class, either from the book, such as our intro to perception, our look at imagery today, or special topics like ecological psychology and signal detection. So because we don't spend time on section 1, that's going to be worth 1/3 of your score. So that's your independent learning section of the exam. And then section number 2 is 2/3 of your score. And further, to remind you, section number 1 will include recognition type questions only. So you do not need a deep understanding or ability to apply that information. It will be limited to, can you recognize the information that you've encountered? Whereas section number 2 will also have recognition type questions, but in addition, we'll have application questions as well. All right, any questions on exam number 2? All right, so let's get to visual imagery. So we're going to start off with a sort of review and expansion upon imagery versus propositional representations. So visual imagery is all about representations. How do we represent our visual information in our minds? So we're going to take a look at 2 possibilities. The fact that the imagery that we experience is due to an imagery form of representation, or is the imagery we experience due to a propositional form of representation? So we'll take a look at those 2. We'll take a look at evidence or studies that try to tease out which one of these representations it might be by looking at mental rotation CogLab, and we're going to compare that to what Shepard and Metzler found, and then we're going to end it with a look at the limits of visual imagery by just reminding you of how bad visual imagery can be before we take a look at how absolutely amazing humans can be at visual imagery. All right, so just to call back to our first encounter with different types of representations. So if you recall, when we were taking a look at representations, we had this example of how do you represent the world, right? So the United States here, it's an actual thing, so we're standing on top of the United States right now. But how do you represent the United States in your mind? So if this is the external reality of the United States, you need to represent this somehow in your mind. If you're going to think about the United States, if you're going to think about the geography of the United States, that means that in your mind somewhere, you have represented the United States, and now you can do cognitive work on that. So the question is how have you represented it? And the internal symbols can be very, very different. Some symbols, some internal symbols could be imagery representations. And what an imagery representation is that in your mind, this information is represented in a way that is maintaining some of the features of the external representation. That's the key to an imagery representation. So if it's a picture that you're representing, your imagery representation actually looks like the picture that you're trying to represent. It maintains some of the qualities or characteristics of that external reality that you're representing. Now, this in no way means that you have a photograph in your head somewhere, right? This in no way means that if we were to take an fMRI of your brain, we would see little photographs of everything that you're representing in your mind. Remember, this is the representational level. This is how we explain how we represent things. It's like the demons in the letter recognition pandemonium model. But in imagery representation, we're hypothesizing that the representations that we use In this case, to think about the United States, those representations actually look like the United States. They share some of the features and maintain some of the features of the United States. So this is one way to represent, in this case, the distances between Los Angeles, New York, and Dallas. We could represent it as an imagery representation where in our mind, the distance between LA and New York is actually bigger than the distance between Dallas and New York, because in the real world, the distance between LA and New York is bigger than the distance between Dallas and New York. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is the propositional representation. And a propositional representation is representing the information just with a series of statements, just with a series of propositions. So if we wanted to represent the geography of the United States, we could just have a long propositional list of Los Angeles to New York, 2,700 miles, New York to Dallas, 1,500, Dallas to Los Angeles, 1,400 miles. And we could just have a long list of descriptions, long list of propositions of what the United States looks like. And notice that nowhere in here is there anything that looks like the structure of the external reality. And that's the propositional definition. Representation. A representation that does not maintain the characteristics of that actual external reality. All right, so continuing on propositional representations, these are representations that consist of lists of propositions, just statements that we somehow represent in our mind about what we know about a particular external reality. That's how we represent that. Importantly, they do not preserve structure. They don't preserve structure whatsoever. So the common analogy, the easiest metaphor for this, is that an imagery representation is like a picture. A propositional representation is like a description of a thing. So let's say that Mona Lisa actually existed. Let's say that there was a woman called Mona Lisa back in Renaissance Italy. That Mona Lisa, that external reality, can be represented in a number of different ways. She could have been represented by a propositional representation, right? She could be represented just with a description of who she is and what she looks like. Kind of like if you were, if she pulled a bank heist and you were a witness and the police officer asked you, who did you see? You would say, well, it was a Caucasian female. She had long hair, hands folded on her lap. That's a propositional representation of Mona Lisa. Notice that it preserves none of the structure of the actual woman. It preserves nothing about the external reality. On the other hand, an imagery representation, it does preserve the structure. So if that same police officer said, hey, did you see who robbed the bank of Milan here? You'd be like, oh yeah, here's a picture of her, right? And this picture maintains the structure. So for example, the eyes on Mona Lisa are above her mouth. The real Mona Lisa had eyes above her mouth. And your representation here has eyes above the mouth on your representation. The real Mona Lisa had a face above her shoulders in the real world. This representation has a face above the shoulders in the representation. So structure that is in the real world is maintained in the representation. Your representation is shaped like the external reality that is trying to represent. So we have this idea of two types of representation. We have the propositional representation, the imagery representation, both representing the same external reality, but in two very, very different ways. All right, so I'll give you a few more examples of the difference between imagery and propositional representations. So it doesn't all have to be visual. You can represent anything in terms of anything else. So for example, sound can be an imagery representation or a propositional representation. So if you have a particular sound external reality that you're trying to represent, you could just write out the frequency, the decibels, and the duration of your sound. So you can just say, well, it starts off at a 500 hertz tone at 20 decibels for 200 milliseconds, and then there's a 300 hertz tone at 15 decibels for 100 milliseconds, and then there's a 200 hertz tone at 10 decibels for 200 milliseconds, and you can just keep going on and on and on and on and on until you've described the sound that is in the external reality. That's a propositional representation. An imagery representation of that sound would be something like this, a visual sound wave. So notice that this doesn't sound like sound, right? It made no noise when it popped up on the screen. But the structure of this is preserved, the structure of the external reality of the sound wave. So when sound is loud, the amplitude of your sound wave is larger, right? The amount of kind of air that it displaces is larger. When it is loud in this representation, the amount of black, the size of the bars here, is larger. So larger in the external world, larger in your representation. When sounds are low, the waves are spread out. When sounds are really high, the waves are compressed together. When you're representing a low sound, spread out. When you're representing a high sound, placed together in the representation. It preserves the structure, even though this is a picture and your sound is a sound. So once again, we have same external reality in a propositional format, and then we have that same external reality in an imagery representation, and those two are trying to represent the same external reality. And you can see that you can do some things with one of these that you can't do with the other, and you can do some things with some of these that you can't do with this one over here. So another example of this, something that you probably held in your hand at some point in your life, maybe. I mean, well, if you have your phone, you're holding it in your hand right now. The difference between digital and analog music. So if you listen to music on your cell phone, you have a representation of sounds that are propositional on your cell phone. If you're streaming things through your app, you are streaming propositional information, propositional representations through your phone. If you're an audiophile and you got records at home, you have an imagery representation of music in those records. So what do we mean by that? Well, when you're listening to digital music, it's just a series of zeros and ones, right? It is literally a series of propositions that say the sound is 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, for the next 20 hours. But anyways, it's just a series of zeros and ones. Looks nothing like sound, but at the same time can represent sound. That's how you hear a song on your phone. A record, on the other hand, has these little grooves in it. And if you take a microscope to those grooves, you'll see that they're actually shaped like the sound that they're representing. They are literally spaced wider if it's a low sound, closer together if it's a high sound. They are deeper if it's a loud sound, not as deep if it's a softer sound. So once again, we have the same song that can be represented in digital format, propositional representation, just a series of ones and zeros, or we have it, and it's again, propositional format, just a series of ones and zeros, or you can do it in imagery representations, where the representation in the record actually preserves the structure of the sound wave that it is representing. So this is the sound wave, or representation of the sound wave. You can see it goes up and down. That sound wave is represented in a record by grooves that maintain that structure and go up and down as well. And then finally, just because the matrix has an example for everything, we are going to take a look at imagery and propositional representations for the matrix as well. So this is a scene where Neo, who is new to this crew, he goes in and he's talking to Cypher, and Cypher is explaining to him what the matrix is and the code of the matrix. So let's take a look at that. and take a look at imagery and propositional representation. So this is going to be an example of propositional representations. All right, it's better with sound.
Matrix?
All right, so just to back it up a bit, they're looking at the matrix right now. They are spying in on that computer simulation that you can go into and kind of have a VR experience that might be what we're living in right now.
So, Matrix? Yeah.
Always look at it and code it.
You get used to it. I don't even see the code. All I see is blonde, brunette, redhead.
All right, so he always looks at it and code it. He doesn't even see the code. All he sees is blonde, brunette, and redhead. So what they're talking about there is they're talking about the propositional representation and then what it's trying to represent. So the matrix itself, the code that you see, that's a propositional representation. That is just a bunch of symbols that indicate a particular external reality. If you're in the matrix, you might actually see a representation of that external reality. So when he said, all I see is blonde, brunette, redhead, it's because he's gotten so good at reading these propositional representations that it's automatic for him to decode what it is that he's reading. It's kind of like when we read a book, you don't really have to sit there and tell yourself, let's really try to imagine, what this person might look like. When they say something like, oh, Harry Potter had glasses and a scar on his forehead, you immediately see it in your mind because you're reading a propositional representation, but it gets you to an imagery representation that you can then manipulate and see in your mind. All right, so propositional imagery representation, there was a big debate as to what it is that we use in our minds. So the one thing that's not up for debate is the fact that we do have images in our mind. So that is something that we can all easily prove. If I just tell you to imagine what a polar bear looks like, we can all bring up an image of a polar bear in our mind. We see this polar bear, and we seem to have this imagery representation. The real debate, though, came from, do we actually use that to do cognitive work, or is that just what they call epiphenomenal? It's just extra. It's just additional stuff that doesn't do anything. It's literally like if you've ever bought, this is so frustrating, if you've ever bought a suit jacket and you find out that the pockets aren't real, right? They're just kind of sewn on little things that, not even the ones where I know you have to open up some of them because they're sewn shut at the store, but sometimes you see a piece of clothing and it's just got that fake pocket that does nothing. That pocket is epiphenomenal, right? It looks like it's doing work. It looks like you can put stuff in there, but you can't use it. It's not doing anything. So the question that psychologists were wondering was, in our minds, when we see those images, when we see those, those visual things in our mind, when we imagine a song and we can hear it in our mind, right? When we get a song stuck in our mind and we just can't unhear it, are we actually using, it feels like an imagery representation, and it is, there's something in there that we're viewing, but are we doing that using imagery representations? Is it being underlied by an imagery representation? Or is it a propositional representation? And what we see in our mind's eye is just that pocket that doesn't really do anything. It's just epiphenomenal, it's extra, it's not doing any work. So the reason that this is important is because, as we saw before, different types of representations can do different types of things, right? So our behavior depends upon how we represent the world that we're dealing with. So remember that train problem about the two trains going to smash into each other and the bird that was flying between the trains. Represented as a distance problem, it's going to take you days to solve. Represented as a time problem, it'll take you 30 seconds to solve. That's a big difference in behavior, all depending upon how we represent things. So sometimes imagery representations would be beneficial. They probably would be more useful. And we've captured this in the idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's easier to show somebody a description of somebody if you have a picture of them, right? Rather than give them a whole list of propositions in order to describe who somebody is. Sometimes propositional representations are actually more useful. And one of the ones where they're more useful, and this is one of the ones that I study, is metaphors. So propositional representations are usually a lot clearer in terms of metaphors. So if you say something like, oh, my boyfriend is a knight in shining armor, right? People know what that means. They know that your boyfriend is very heroic, he's very courteous, he's nice, he's honorable. They know what knight in shining armor means. But try to convey this in a picture, right? It doesn't really work. Like you can't say, if somebody asks you, oh, do you have a picture of your boyfriend? And you said, oh yeah, here you go. They won't look at that and say, wow, he really seems like a nice guy. He seems very courteous. He seems very polite. He seems very honorable. No, they'll look at that and they'll say, I don't get it. I don't get the actual metaphor. So propositional representations are easier to convey metaphors, right? So this is what you're trying to say, that your boyfriend is more like Gallant and less like Goofus, but it's hard to get across visually, right? So that imagery representation is more difficult in this case for metaphors. I'll give you another example. We'll go on the other side. So if you say, my girlfriend is a real fox, people know what that means, right? They know it's not this. They know that this is not what you mean when you say my girlfriend is a real fox. What you mean is something like this: that your girlfriend is highly attractive, that your girlfriend is, very, sexual. And this, for example, I'm very proud of this one. This is the meta-metaphor. And if you know who she is, you'll know why that is. All right, anyways. That is, so that's the instance here. Different things, imagery representations, propositional representations, they impact how our behavior operates. And if we want to know what's going on in our mind, we can use our behavior to infer. Are we using visual or are we using propositional representations? So the fact that we have visual imagery is not up for debate. We know we have visual imagery. Imagine a polar bear. We can do it. So we have that. But the question is, do we actually use it for cognition? If we're thinking about polar bears, are we actually using that image in our mind to think about polar bears? Or are we using a series of propositions and that image of a polar bear is just a smoke that's coming off the fire that we are using for our propositions for, right? Is it just a little bit of extra added stuff that doesn't actually do anything? So is that visual imagery used for cognition, or is it an extra experience? And again, that's that idea of epiphenomenal, that it's just that added phenomenon that does nothing else. All right, so how do they determine, or how do they propose to decide this? Well, the argument goes that if imagery, and we're going to stick to the visual aspect of this, but this works for all imagery representations. So if visual imagery, is actually underlined by a imagery representation, if the polar bear we see in our mind is actually the representation that we're using to do thinking about polar bears, then it's going to preserve some structure. That representation will preserve some structure that an actual polar bear has. And if structure in the real world determines performance in the real world, which it does, then that structure should similarly determine performance in our mental world. So if something is heavy to lift in the real world, it should be heavy to lift in our mental world if we're using an imagery representation. If something is slow in the real world, we should be slower to think about it in our mental world if we're using an imagery representation. If there's structure in the real world that impacts performance, and we're using that structure in our representations, our thinking about it should be impacted in the same way. That's the argument to try to determine whether we use visual imagery or not. Is that argument clear? Make sense? All right, let's take a look at some evidence that they found to argue for the presence of visual imagery, the fact that we actually use visual imagery. All right, so this was the mental rotation, CogLab. So in this CogLab, you were shown two 3D block shapes, and they were shown on the screen, and your task was just to determine whether those two shapes are the same or are they different shapes. So are they two shapes that are the same or are they different? And the independent variable that you had was the degree of rotation in depth. So these two images could be either rotated not at all, so they were exactly in the same amount of rotation, or they could have 20 degrees of difference, 40 degrees of difference, 60 degrees of difference, all the way up to 120 degrees of difference. And your task was to just take a look at those and say, yes, those are the same, no, they're different. So this is an example of two objects here where they are exactly the same. So this would be an indication of two that are the same. And then over here we have two that are different. So it doesn't matter how you rotate these, you cannot match these up. They're actually two very, very different things. So in this case, you would hit different in order to get the correct answer. All right, so this is a replication. What you did was a replication of what Shepard and Metzler did back in 1971. And for their two images, and these are two images taken directly from their study, they measured how long does it take to determine if they're the same object. So they were doing a reaction time study. How long does it take you to make the determination that these two are the same? And is that a function of how rotated they are? So if it was the case, and then they also had ones that you had to rotate in the plane, and they had ones that you had to rotate in depth in order to try to solve this challenge. So they had ones where you have to rotate it like this in the plane, and they had ones where you have to try to mentally rotate it like that in depth. So why would this kind of give us an idea of whether or not we're dealing with a propositional or a imagery representation? Well, it has to do with what happens in the real world. So in the real world, if you have two objects, I got two objects that are the same. If you had two objects and they were similar, this is immediately apparent. But if you had two objects and you were trying to figure out are they the same, you would actually take one and you would rotate it. And the further you had to rotate it in the real world, the longer it would take you to determine whether they're the same or not, right? So in the real world, the further the two are different and have different amounts of rotation, the longer it's going to take you to physically move one of them so that it matches up with the other one to determine yes, they're the same or no, they're not. So in the real world, if you were doing this task, the more rotated these objects are, the longer it would take you to say yes, they're the same or no, they're not. That's in the real world. So what happens if we're using a propositional representation in our mental world? Well, if we're using a propositional representation, then what's on the left side here, we could represent it with a series of propositions. And we could say, this is going to be a simplified version of this. The actual representation would be much more complex. But we could say something to the effect of, well, you got 3 cubes, 1, 2, 3. And then you got a 90-degree turn. And then you have, I started at the back here. You got 3 cubes, 1, 2, 3. Then you got a 90-degree turn. Then you have another 3 cubes, 1, 2, 3. Then you have another 90-degree turn. Then you have 2 cubes, 1, 2. Then you have another 90-degree turn. And then you have a final 2 cubes, 1, 2, and that's your object. That's the one on the left side. The one on the right side, you would say you got 3 cubes, and then you have a 90-degree turn, and then you have 3 more cubes, and you have a 90-degree turn, and then you have 2 more cubes, and a 90-degree turn, and then finally you got 2 more cubes, and that's your entire object. So we have the left side represented as a proposition, we have the right side represented as a proposition, and the way that you would solve whether these two are the same or whether they're different is just go proposition by proposition and see if they check out. So proposition number 1, 3 cubes, good. Proposition number 2, 90 degrees, perfect. Proposition number 3, 3 cubes, great. Number 4, check. Number 5, check. Number 6, check. Number 7, check. All of them match up. These two objects are the same. That's a propositional representation. Notice that it doesn't matter whether they're rotated like this or whether they're not rotated at all. You still have to go through your checklist, the entire checklist, to determine with a propositional representation, are they the same or are they different? So a propositional representation would not, your reaction time, your ability to do this task, should not be affected by how rotated the objects are. Make sense so far? All right. For a visual imagery representation, your left side would be an image of the shape, and your right side would be another image of the shape. And because this preserves structure, what you need to do is you need to rotate that right side until it visually matched up with the left side. And because this is an imagery representation, that rotation is going to take time. It's going to preserve the structure that we see in the real world. It's going to preserve that actual physical reality that it takes time to rotate things. If your visual imagery has the same structure, it'll take time to rotate things. So in this case, the further they're rotated, the longer it's going to take you to make that determination of yes, they're the same, and that is going to be for regardless of how they're put, whether they're rotated in depth or in the plane. Propositional representation, same time, regardless of rotation. You should be equally fast going through your propositions, regardless of how rotated your images are. For an imagery representation, you should have increasing reaction times as the rotation increases. When you don't have to rotate very far, it's going to be very quick. When you have to rotate a far distance, you're going to be much, much slower. Oh, jumped the gun there. All right, so what did Shepard and Metzler find? So let's take a look at their mean reaction time for the same pairs. And as you can see, here we have the pairs where they were rotating things in depth, so rotating like this. On the top graph, we have the ones that were rotated in the picture plane, so rotating like this. And on the bottom here, we have the angle of rotation, so increasing angle of rotation. And then on the y-axis here, we have the reaction time in seconds. And it is very, very clear that as rotation increases, your time that it takes you to say, yes, those two are the same, increases with the amount of rotation. So this is very much what we would expect if we're actually using a visual image representation. If the visual image representation is actually what is doing the cognitive work, it's actually how we represent this situation, then as rotation increases, reaction time should increase, and that's exactly what Shepard and Metzler found. So that was Shepard and Metzler back in 1971. Let's take a look at what we actually found in our CogLab. So for the same shape trials, once again, we have rotation degrees on the x-axis here. We have reaction time on the y-axis here. So this is in milliseconds. So this is one at about 1.6 seconds. This is 2 seconds right there. And as you can see, we have a little bit of an asymptotic function. But importantly, once again, we have increasing reaction times as rotation increased. So it took you longer to say these two are the same as the rotation increased. And that, again, is consistent with this idea of imagery representations. So you were rotating in depth. This is Shepard and Metzler's depth rotation studies. And as you can see, same pattern of results. The larger the rotation, the longer it takes to make that determination of, yes, these two are the same. Any questions on those results? All right. What about for the different shape trials? So what happened when the two did not match up? What happened in that particular instance? So in this instance, we have the rotation once again in degrees. We got the reaction time on the y-axis. These are the same trials that we just saw. So this is when the two were the same and you have to make a decision of, yes, those two matched up. And then you'll see that there's increasing reaction times as the rotation increases. And if you take a look at the pairs that did not match up, that's the reaction time for the pairs that did not match. And you found the same processing time regardless of how far, regardless of their initial rotation. All right, so that is a little bit different than what we found for the same trials. So both of these, though, kind of represent or support that idea of visual imagery, that increased time as rotation increases. So this might be one of the discussion questions, but I'll bring it up here while this is nice and big. Does anybody know why there was no increase in times when they did not match? Mm-hmm.
Because you still have to rotate it all the way around.
Exactly. Exactly. So the only way to determine, apparently, in our minds, the only way to determine if something did not match up was to rotate it the full way around. And that's why you can see here that it starts to match up. It matches up with the longest time that we had, that 120-degree rotation. It took you about that long. You have to go the whole way around before you let yourself decide that, oh no, these two do not match up. All right, so both of these kind of represent, or both of these are consistent with an imagery representation. Definitely this pattern here for the same pairs is consistent with imagery representation. Propositional representation, if both lines looked like this, for same and different, that would support propositional, but this one here is the big one that says, no, we're actually using our imagery representations. They're actually doing some sort of work. All right, so the pattern of the results, we kind of answered this one already. They're more consistent with imagery than propositional representations, especially the one for the same results. So what strategy is your mind using? Basically, did anybody have, or were they aware of how they were trying to solve same ones and different ones? Well, how about a show of hands? Did anybody consciously know what they were doing? How about a show of hands? Does anybody remember doing this CogLab? So it was a while back. All right, so probably what you remember doing is you remember looking at one of the images and you try to imagine it in different rotations. You try to imagine it moving in different rotations. I highly doubt that any of you really either saw things and then immediately said, oh yes, those two are the same, I can just see it, I just feel it. Or started counting up blocks and going, okay, 2 and then 3, 2 and then 3, 90 degree in the yaw dimension or whatever. Probably you did not do that. And then the strategy that we already mentioned for the ones that were different was to go through the entire rotation, and that's why they all took the longest. So the pattern of the same shape trials, more consistent with imagery than propositional representations. And again, that's because we're going through the steps as we go through that representation. Mm-hmm.
So I actually did something completely different. If you go back to the slide, I tried to picture that one wasn't.
Yeah, no, okay, we'll go back to the original. Yep.
So I tried to picture, so since they each have that two-tail cube at the end, I tried to picture what it would look like if they were like sitting together, like one on top of the other.
Okay.
So then it's different because one went to the left and one went to the right, but they start off the same.
Oh, okay. So when you say that you imagine them one on top of another, did you literally, like, in your mind kind of move them to where they're on top? Okay. So if that's the case, what would you expect your trials to look like as a function of rotation? Does anybody have a guess what those trials should look like? All right, it's a difficult thing because we got a few things that are moving here, but this is the kind of predictions that we would make in as a cognitive psychologist. So you said that you took the two images and you just mentally moved them until they were one on top of another, and that allowed you to make your choice. That was a strategy that you used. If that's the case, if that was actually what your mind was doing, so I have no doubt that you think that's what your mind was doing. Right? So we would actually take a look at your reaction times to see if that was what your mind was doing. And what we should find is that because this distance was the same for every single trial, it should take you the same amount for every single pair to determine whether they're the same or whether they're different. Because if what your strategy is to move the two of them together, if you're using a propositional representation, it'll take about the same time. If you're using an imagery representation, because each pair was the same distance, it should take you the same amount of time to do that. So if that's what we find, then you were consciously aware of the strategy that you were using. That is actually what your mind was doing. If, on the other hand, we found another pattern of results, that would mean that your strategy was epiphenomenal. You think that's what you were doing, but in reality, your cognitive work was something else entirely. So that would actually be an interesting kind of like individual data piece to take a look at, because again, different ways of representing things in different strategies have different behavioral consequences, and that's how we would get to what is actually going on in your mind. Very nice. Hassan, another hand? Yep.
Now, if you got one wrong, it made you just do it again, which is obviously the other answer.
Mm-hmm.
How does that affect the result?
Well, that would have a really weird kind of effect on the results. It's kind of hard to predict because you would definitely be faster. Was it immediately? The next one was
Yeah,
the one? Okay.
It wasn't same, it was different. It was the same thing, the same picture.
Okay.
So that's why I was kind of confused on why they made you try it again, like right after.
Yeah. Either they were doing that for educational purposes, just to make sure that you actually were going through and doing the whole thing.
Right.
But there is another possibility, because if you take a look at the data, you'll notice that in our data here in 2020, it kind of asymptotes at the top here, right? It kind of like decreases its increasing amounts, right? Asymptotes at the top. Whereas Shepard and Metzler's kind of just went straight up, very linear. It's quite possible that if there were more errors when they were further rotated, and they counted your second trial and took like the average of the two trials, it's quite possible that this nonlinear kind of trend here, like it should have gone up here, but it got pulled down here. It is quite possible that those trials where you got it wrong and then immediately they put it up and you got it right, that decreased it more for the ones that had a large rotation in order to do it, because those are the more difficult ones. So that could account for why we have this kind of like decreasing amount of increase in reaction time, where Shepard and Metzler did not. That's a very nice point.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure how that showed any type of accuracy.
Well, usually what you would do,
You got it wrong.
yeah,
Try again. Now you got it right.
if I was designing this as an actual experiment, you probably wouldn't get a second chance
Right.
to do it, because that would give you a training effect. And if I was designing it as an experiment / in-class activity, I would not count that second one. I would say, oh, here's another chance for you to do it correctly, and then in the program it would just say disregard the reaction time on that one.
Yeah, I thought maybe
Yeah.
you were comparing an average amount of how many people got the same ones wrong.
They probably got that data
Something like
somewhere.
that.
Yep. Because you need to know that too. I mean, the ones that they typically when they graph results like this, these are the ones that people get correct.
Right.
And if you ever take a look at the ones where they get it incorrect, those are usually all over the map. Like getting things wrong is extremely interesting, but it's really hard to know what's going on, because people get things. There's a million ways to get things wrong, and it comes out in the data, and the data is very jumbled. Okay. There's a million ways. That just fell from the ceiling. Yeah.
I wondered, like that.
I know, and I was just, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that happened. So there's a million ways to get things wrong. There's usually only one way to get things right.
Right.
So when people do things correctly and they get the right answer, usually the data just kind of like all comes together, and everybody's basically doing the same thing. When you get it wrong, it's like all over the place. Yeah. So that's why they usually exclude the wrong ones, the wrong trials. And like everybody, you know what? Did everybody see that?
Yeah.
I saw it coming down, and it's just weird sometimes. You're just like, but you're like paralyzed. Like nobody was like, look out, like it's coming down. Right? Sort of like I failed as a hero. All right. Yeah. Well, we're never gonna forget this class, right? Because it'll just be the class when fluff came from the sky. All right. So what strategy are we using? What strategy is your mind using? All right, so we kind of covered those. Different strategies lead to different behavioral results, different reaction times. And for our study here, it seems that most of us were using that rotational strategy where we actually were rotating an imagery representation in our mind, and it mimics the features that we would have rotating real external objects, where the more you need to rotate it, the longer it's going to take you. All right, so we're going to wrap up today with, we took a look at imagery representations. We're going to wrap up with a look at extreme imagery representations. So we're just going to mention the bad, and then we're going to take a look at the good. So the bad we've already seen, and that includes change blindness. So remember the examples of change blindness. Remember the example of the inspector trying to determine who murdered Lord Smythe, right? And there was like 21 changes, and the entire class as a whole, we saw like 7, right? So sometimes your imagery representations, if you're using imagery representations, they're very poor, right? They're very underdeveloped. They're not very detailed. Sometimes, however, people do have extremely developed imagery representations. So when people have photographic memories, very difficult to explain photographic memories relying on propositional representations. So we're going to see an example of photographic memory with Stephen Wiltshire, and it is very difficult to explain what he does using anything other than imagery representations, because you're going to see that he has representations in his mind that preserve details the same way that a photograph would. They work almost exactly the same as a photograph, and again, it's really hard to understand that as anything other than an imagery representation. So we're going to see 2 videos of his work, and one of them is when he draws New York, and then the second one is going to be a comparison of what does New York actually look like compared to what he draws.
I'm Stephen Wiltshire.
Oh yeah, no, I have it.
I'm an artist. I'm in New York City. New York is my favorite city.
Stephen is an artistic savant. I think drawing for Stephen is like air and water for us. He cannot live without it. I'm Stephen's sister. I'm extremely proud of him.
All right, so before we go on with the rest of this, it's very interesting what they just said. They think that drawing is like breathing for him. That's very important to him. And there has been a lot of research that's come out in the last decade or so about the importance of drawing to thinking. So in our curriculum, we are very heavily writing based, right? There's a lot of professors and a lot of courses here that are teaching you to write, how to write, and how to become better writers. And nobody here is at all thinking that we're preparing you to be, a novelist or anything like that. You might become a novelist, right? But for most of you, that's not going to be your career path. It's not what you're going to choose. So why are we very heavily leaning into writing? Why are we very heavily teaching you how to write? And the basic idea is that writing is another form of thinking. Like if you can write, you can think. And the better you can write, the better you can think. Not because it reflects your thinking, but it's actual thinking. Putting things on a page, organizing it on the page is actually a way that we think. And if you've ever done something where you're like, okay, I have this big project, let me just write it down so I can organize it. You're thinking using writing. That's a way that you think. There's a lot of research that is being done showing how important drawing is to thinking as well. So the conference that I just went to had a keynote address by Nick Susanis, and if you follow my Twitter account, you'll see the link to the his live recording of his keynote address. And he put out the fact that when he draws, he thinks, and he can solve problems because he draws them out, and it's a form of thinking. So there is a revolution that is going on, much like what Steve Wiltshire kind of does in how he thinks, where it's actually moving towards teaching students how to draw, how to use visual language in order to give them the ability to think better.
I'm going to do a drawing of New York City from the memory. I feel excited. It's a beautiful city. Lots of skyscrapers. My favorite is the Empire State Building. It's a brilliant building. It was so beautiful out there. Nice and sunny.
Every aspect of what he sees comes alive on paper.
All right, so before we get to the big paper, all right, so he's taking notes. Okay, this is literally him taking notes. The same way that you're in this class kind of writing down a little bit of what we're going over. This is him taking notes. And notice how undetailed these images are. All right, that's going to be important. So he does take notes. He does think like we think verbally, but notice how little detail he has. It's going to be important for what he's about to do.
Every aspect of what he sees comes alive on paper.
So this morning I figured it out. We'll start with the Brooklyn up to the Midtown Manhattan, all the way to Queens. Gonna start now.
I would love to be in his mind to actually see how he sees things. Stephen was mute until the age of 5, so drawing was a form of his speech. This was his language. He has a phenomenal memory and is able to memorize cityscapes, landscapes, how many windows, floors, chimneys to watch.
So notice, none of that detail is in there until he starts going over it in marker. So it's as if he is tracing, right? You take a look at how he draws things, it's almost like he's tracing. So what is he tracing? Well, he has this image of his mind, in his mind of what he saw in New York, and he's just looking at, as if you're like, oh, imagine that your polar bear is out here in the real world. And he is literally just kind of tracing what he has in his visual imagery representation. Almost impossible to explain this propositionally. He has to be working from an imagery representation, and way better than what we have, considering we couldn't even notice, 7 of the changes in the whodunit change detection.
To touch the paper, it's almost like fine embroidery. You can actually see it develop. I never get tired of it.
This is it, it's done now. So I feel happy and good. I'm very proud of my work.
It's purely Stephen's own determination that he is where he is today.
Do the best you can and never stop.
All right, so that was his drawing of New York. Now let's see how it matches up. Whoa!
All this week we have been featuring the art of Stephen Wiltshire in our series, An Early Beautiful Memory. He was diagnosed with autism at age 3, did not speak until he was 5, but today he is known worldwide for the beautiful panoramas he creates from memory. Over the weekend, Stephen began working on a 20-foot cityscape of New York. He is just about finished. He's nearing completion anyway. And CBS's Michelle Gielan is at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, where Stephen is working this morning. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning, Aaron. He's put a lot of hard work into it, and boy, has it paid off. He started all the way up here at the George Washington Bridge, and then continued down through Manhattan, New Jersey, Financial District, and he's heading over to Brooklyn now. The detail is really the amazing part because, as you know, it's all from memory. So let's take a look at some comparison shots to some still photos of Manhattan. First, take a look at Midtown. And as you can see, the detail is absolutely incredible. Now the Financial District. And the comparison shot, the buildings, the skyline, and then let's take a look at Liberty Island. All of this was from a 20-minute helicopter ride. He just took a look at it and then could put it down on paper. So let's talk to Stephen now.
All right, so before they talk to Stephen, I'll point out something even more amazing about what he's done. So they've done things where they've checked his drawing against the actual external reality, and they found like little side streets. He's gotten those correct. Numbers of windows, he's gotten correct. And I'm sure that if they checked the cars and the people that he draws in, they were probably there at the time when he had done that 20-minute ride. But very impressively, and this is what kind of astounds me, if you take a look at perspective geometry, perspective projection, it determines what is visible from a certain point of view. It determines what is visible from a helicopter point of view. And if you take a look at these two pictures here, you'll notice that it doesn't quite match up. Like this building over here is too big in Stephen Wiltshire's picture compared to what the building is over here from this vantage point. But that's not the vantage point Stephen was at. That's not a picture from his helicopter ride. From his helicopter ride, that was a vantage point that he had. So you can see that he actually was, in his helicopter would have been lower, right? Where this one is taken from a more aerial view. This one is taken from a lower view. And if you take a look at what he actually saw, the point of view from the helicopter ride, he reproduces that down to like literally what they used to do in Renaissance painting. What they used to do in Renaissance painting. If you've ever seen a really realistic Renaissance painting, some of them, what they did is they would go into a dark room. They would put a pinhole camera, opposite of what they wanted to represent. So if I want to draw a picture of everybody here, I would go into a dark room where my canvas was. I would put a little hole that would let the light in. That would make a pinhole camera. This image in this room would get projected onto my canvas, and I would trace it. And that's how I could get a very realistic picture of what's in this room. When you trace things, you get perspective distortions that you can objectively measure. Stephen Wiltshire has the same kind of perspective geometry distortions in his work. It really is him in his mind just tracing over exactly what he saw. So we're going to talk to him a little bit. I want to let this run.
Good morning.
Let's see what he has to say.
Your work is incredible. Tell us, what's your favorite part of New York?
The Manhattan. Manhattan is my favorite. They've got lots of skyscrapers and the big, tall, the tallest and the avenues, and they're very huge. They've got lots of yellow New York taxi cabs.
Lots of taxi cabs. Thank you so much.
Also, you can.
And Stephen also told us, Harry, that his.
You can see some of the challenges of discussing with an autistic individual, but I will notice that, I will point out just to kind of end, his mind is it's very astounding, but it's also very similar to us. So the visual imagery, not at all similar to us. That's like way beyond what any of us could do. But notice what his favorite stuff was. His favorite stuff was the big stuff, the big things that he liked to draw, right? So he likes to draw big skyscrapers. Of course Manhattan's going to be his favorite because it's got the big skyscrapers. So I once went to, just kind of, I'll flex my nerd cred here at the end. I once went to an anime convention where we actually met the voice actors from one of the animes. And I asked them, I go, what was your favorite episode to film? In your anime, what was your favorite episode to film? And every single one of them chose the episode that featured their character because it had the most lines for them to do. Every single one of them was like, that was my favorite episode. Same thing with Steven. He likes big buildings. Manhattan's his favorite. Mine works just like ours in a lot of ways, but his visual imagery, off the charts. And it really has to do with the fact that for him, drawing is thinking, and he thinks, you know, with his beautiful mind, and he literally, as I said, when he draws, it's like he's tracing what he sees in his mind. Almost impossible to explain that with a propositional representation. All right, so that is it for what I wanted to cover today. Any comments or questions on anything we've seen here before we wrap up? All right, so this marks the official end of what's going to be on exam number 2. So we are going to meet next class. We're going to start up our look at memory. However, this is the end of where you need to prepare for exam number 2. So other than that, we're done for the day. I'll see you all next time.